facilitators so we can use the time wisely. Other than that, if you want to speak or something, we need to you need to raise your hand, and then in the Q&A part, we can ask people to start sharing their questions lively. But we will be prioritizing those written questions that have been shared while our speakers were speaking. That's it from my end, and I wish you a happy hours. And here off to you, Alex. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Welcome to this public event of the Global Coalition for Tech Justice. I'm Alexandra Pardal, Co-Executive Director of Digital Action, the conveners of the coalition. Now, we're gathered here today because we're now more than 3 months into 2024, the biggest elections megacycle in decades, with over 65 elections taking place at a moment of historic democratic decline across the globe. This is at a time when online platforms, Google, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, X, Twitter, and new AI technologies are at the height of their reach and influence across the globe. Now, are the companies behind these online platforms and technologies doing enough to stop the spread of disinformation, hate speech, or the manipulation of bad actors undermining electoral integrity and human rights? The elections in the first quarter of this year point to a resounding no. The companies have gutted their trust and safety in electoral integrity teams over the past 18 months. Tens of thousands of safety professionals and regional and thematic safety teams, some of which have been entirely disbanded. In elections across Asia in the first quarter of this year, we've seen in Indonesia the election of a new president, Prabowo Subianto, a former special forces commander dismissed from the military following allegations of involvement in torture, elected. AI-generated deepfakes, a fixture across social media platforms in the lead up to the ballots there. In one AI-modified TikTok video of musician Taylor Swift purportedly thanking Prabowo Subianto for helping me, which racked up over 500,000 views before being taken down. In Pakistan, a proliferation in the use of deepfakes circulated across social media platforms as a strategy to influence voters and undermine female politicians, undermine female journalists, also undermine male candidates, purporting to show them abusing family members, for example. And many failed to identify deepfakes being used. In Taiwan, rampant disinformation and Chinese influence operations across TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, with a marked rise in AI-generated content, including deepfake videos targeting pro-independence candidates and stoking fears of conflict. In Taiwan, it took an all-society effort involving fact-checkers and educators to fend off online platform-enabled Chinese operations which were attacking the integrity of the elections. At a time when they're most needed to keep people in elections safe, online platforms are failing. And with far fewer resources available to safety teams, Silicon Valley firms are prioritizing November's United States elections over all others, no matter the risk of harm present. Today, as civil society leaders of the Global Coalition for Tech Justice, we're calling for online platforms, tech platforms, to urgently adopt and apply comprehensive measures to safeguard people and elections this year and into the future, applying principles of global equity. We want full disclosure of these measures and full cooperation with civil society, including fact-checking and platform monitoring researchers and activists. We're also making an urgent call for break glass measures. That's additional safety measures during the elections to prevent the spread of harmful content and manipulation campaigns for all remaining elections this year. We want equitable implementation of these break glass measures, not just in the United States and Europe, but for the global majority as well. Democracies are at stake. People's lives are at risk if these measures aren't put in place. Big tech companies bear the greatest responsibility for what happens on their platforms. But I also want to stress now that major governments and institutions around the world can no longer turn a blind eye to the massive market failures in this industry globally. We have the G20 coming up, with the Brazilian presidency of the G20 stating that information integrity will be a priority. This will only be meaningful if G20 governments agree to a global mandatory standard for platforms. That's what we're going to be calling for. With the introduction of the EU's Digital Services Act and various mandatory standards in the UK, Australia, and some US states, we now have a two-tiered system where platforms are diverting trust and safety resources and platform monitoring access to the richest countries and negligently leaving behind the rest of the world where some of the worst tech harms are taking place. 2024 is not a drill. If no action is taken by these companies and their regulators, we're going to see a devastating decline in democracies, democratic trust, an escalation of conflicts, and a corrosion of people's rights and safety. It's not too late for big tech to play a part this year to protect people in elections. And to talk us through two major upcoming elections in India and South Africa, I'm very pleased to welcome our partners in the Global Coalition for Tech Justice. First of all, Kristen Abrahams, who's an attorney at the Legal Resources Centre in South Africa. We're also joined by Ritumbra, Manuvie, co-founder and executive director at Foundation The London Story, and Maen, Hammad, human rights campaigner and researcher at ECHO. I'll first turn to Kristen to talk us through the South African elections. Kristen, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody, and good evening. It's already evening here in South Africa, so good evening and thank you for joining. And thank you so much for giving us space on this platform to share our experiences and some of our research and findings. I think I'll start by just setting the scene about what's happening in South Africa at the moment. So South Africans are going to the polls on the 29th of May this year, and all polls are showing that this is likely to be the most highly contested election since South Africa's first democratic election in '94. There are about 52 political parties who are contesting this election. And of those, previous experience and some of the newer political parties, some of them are campaigning around anti-migrant, anti-refugee issues, some of which have in previous elections been held by a court of law in violation of the Electoral Code of Conduct for the online harassment of journalists. Some political parties have in the past created inauthentic accounts for the spreading of certain political messages. And then some of the political parties have also already declared that they are going to dispute the election outcomes of this particular election. And so we see that it's not just disinformation that will pose a threat to democracy and actual democratic participation, because it erodes trust in the media and in democratic institutions, but it's also hateful speech and incitement to violence on these platforms that has the same effect. And so what we've done at the LRC and in partnership with Global Witness is we've run 2 investigations so far, and perhaps we'll be looking at a third, I think, that may be centered on disinformation. But the 2 investigations that we've run thus far were both based on and contained hate speech and incitement to violence in the form of adverts. And what the methodology involved is that we looked for real life examples of, just hateful speech in the first investigation targeted at migrants and refugees in South Africa. And the second one was really just violent, misogynistic hate speech targeted at women and those who identify as women in South Africa. And in both of these investigations, we took those real life examples and then converted them into adverts. And what that allowed us to do is schedule them for posting, 2 weeks in advance without actually making those adverts go live. So none of the content that we created actually was ever posted onto the platforms or online in any form, but we were able to schedule them for posting 2 weeks before time, and then see whether these platforms rejected or verified the ads for approval. In our first investigation, the one that had the xenophobic hate speech, we tested YouTube, Facebook, and TikTok. And in the second one, which had the hate speech targeted at women, we included X in that investigation. All of the adverts that we designed, in the first investigation, we had about 38 ads, and in the second, we had 40 ads. All of them were a flagrant violation of all of those platforms' content moderation policies. And it wasn't subtle, you know, it was explicit, hateful language aimed at either refugees or women. They included calls to shoot and kill women or refugees. There were posts that compared refugees to animals and to diseases. There were posts that called women psychopaths or vermin or prostitutes. And in the first investigation, all of the social media platforms approved all of the adverts that we had put through for approval. Facebook, I think, rejected one ad, and it was just the English and Afrikaans versions of those ads, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And in the second investigation, most of the adverts were accepted as well. On TikTok on YouTube in the second investigation, 21 ads were marked as not appropriate for all audiences, but there was just a slight limitation. And then on X in the second investigation, there were just 2 ads in English that were halted. What was critical, I think, to our methodology was making sure that these adverts and the content was in different South African languages. So all of them had an English component, but then were translated into Afrikaans, isiZulu, and isiXhosa, which are widely spoken languages across South Africa. And really the results, I think, were appalling, but not unexpected. We've seen the results from previous Global Witness investigations, and we've seen how all of these social media platforms have failed to properly moderate content, and especially when that content was not in English or was coming from the Global South. Subsequent to that, we did have some response from TikTok, who reached out to us and said that they'd like to meet and talk about our findings, but they subsequently reneged on that, and we weren't able to actually have that meeting with them. And so something that we thought would be a different way to approach what was happening on platforms in South Africa would be to use South African laws. We have an act here called the Promotion of Access to Information Act, or termed as PAIA, and we did requests for information from these platforms in terms of PAIA. We then got responses both from Meta and from Google saying that because the parent company is organized and created under laws in the US, the PAIA laws here in South Africa don't apply to these organizations. And so it's been really a struggle to try to interact with big tech platforms, to try to get them to engage in what we're saying, and even just the results that we found. When we asked for comment, we were sort of told, at least from Meta for both investigations, the response was verbatim, it's generic. Really just said people and machines don't always get things right, and we're sure we'll miss things sometimes. TikTok was a little bit more assuring. They assured us of the number of content moderators they have who speak South African languages, but then also sort of just said we'll have to look into it and see how we can better moderate content, because hate speech has no place on our platforms. So just to say that we are fearful about the impact that the unaccountability of big tech platforms has and will and could possibly have on our election in South Africa this year. We are fearful for the lives of people living in South Africa. We are fearful about the things that political parties will campaign around and how they will stoke existing tensions within our country on social media, and that will prove or be used as a catalyst for real world harm. And so we're grateful to be speaking on this platform today, and we sincerely hope that this form of advocacy will have some effect. Thanks so much, Alex. And I will now hand over to Ritu. She will be talking to us about India and the upcoming election there, and some of the investigations that they've done in that region.
Thanks a lot, Kristen, for your remarks, and thanks a lot, everyone, for joining us. I'm a little mindful. Well, I just arrived a little late in London today, and I'm still standing at the securities to get out of the place because of my flight delays. But I'm really glad for Digital Action to be organizing this event and the Global Coalition for Tech Justice for particularly organizing this webinar on Global South. And I'm very grateful that we have assembled to express our concerns and also to discuss what's happening in South Africa and India. I am also mindful of the fact that I'm sitting in Europe away from my home country, and I speak perhaps with a degree of privilege and comfort that several of human rights defender colleagues don't currently have in India. I am the co-founding director of Foundation London Story, an Indian diaspora-led nonprofit, and my job and my organization is basically to look at the disinformation and hate speech in India and what is happening with the minorities within my country. As you may know, my country will be voting in roughly 48 hours from now, and over the weeks over the weeks till now, we have been looking a lot of we have been carrying out a lot of research on social media companies, and we have come to a saddening conclusion that they are not really ready for the election. And not just they're not ready for the election, we have also seen the decades of work of civil society organization in fighting for transparency and accountability towards election and democracy has been reversed by profit motives of big tech, and they have consistently been giving loudspeaker to far-right actors which seek to divide us. We have seen a network of coordinated behaviors that have consistently and continuously in the past undermined human rights and human dignity of minorities and Dalits in India, and they continue to get platform on social media. And I would like to share just one example with you on a case that we worked with Meta for over 2 years, and this was a far-right hate speaker, Yati Narasimhan, and his video where he clearly calls out for annihilation of Muslims, which is clearly against the platform standards, had 32 million views, and it took us 2 years to get that just one video removed. And of the reason that Meta only removed that video and not the actors who are posting this, or the coordinated network of actors who are posting these videos in several different platforms, this network still stays there. And more recently, this same video, which was removed, has been posted up again, and it has 1.2 million views. So social media platforms have consistently allowed bad actors, and they continue to allow these bad actors on the platform. And despite laws in my country, which includes laws against incitement of violence or incitement of communal disharmony, laws which are taking care of our election transparency and accountability, these actors, the platforms keep hiding behind a facade of excuses, making us think that there is no law, and that there is digital reality is a new sort of reality which we need to regulate. Yes, perhaps to some extent, but unfortunately, it's not completely true. And India, like many other global South countries, have fought for a system of accountability and transparency in democracy. And we would like social media companies to recognize this reality and stop destroying the democracy. And I would like to now basically pass the mic to my colleague Maen, who has been working together with me on the India research and also across the world to share his experiences of how things are on social media. Thanks a lot.
Hi, thanks Ritu and everybody on the call. It's great to be here, especially at a time like now with all these elections kicking off. So I'm Maen. I am a campaigner with corporate campaigning organization ECHO. We are a corporate watchdog with over 20 million members around the world, where we focus on where and when corporations are sort of acting badly. We have a team that works specifically on tech accountability, which runs investigations related to disinformation and hate speech on tech platforms, especially when and how they are subverting democracy. We've been looking at the sort of harmful spread of election disinformation for a few years now, and what I'll try to do in my intervention is give two examples from not too long ago. One is Brazil in 2022 and 2023, as well as a short investigation we did last August around the DSA. Mainly just to give some examples, I think colleagues on the call have sort of summarized a lot of the big problems and given some examples of some contemporary issues. And I sort of just want to connect some of these dots by showing how the global south in a lot of ways is sort of this testing ground for the worst of the worst when it comes to tech harms, and to highlight that this problem is not something that those in the global north or the west should think of as sort of too distant, as these problems sort of get recycled and pop their head up in places, within the Silicon Valley and West bubble. So one example that I think was quite telling, that sort of encapsulates many of the different points that both Kristen and Ritu had summarized, is Brazil in 2022 and 2023. Ahead of the 22 election between Bolsonaro and Lula, the sort of platforms were, and by platforms, I kind of mean all of them, meta platforms, YouTube, TikTok, Telegram, WhatsApp, all sort of were filled with these calls inciting violence and calls for, before the election kicked off, a September 7th sort of anti-democratic uprising. And granted, this was not too far away from what had happened on January 6th in the US Capitol and the insurrection there. So it was kind of puzzling to see how this sort of recycled tactic of calls for violence was sort of just propagated on the platforms sort of with open arms. I mean, election disinformation was sort of peddled, which was discrediting the electoral process. And then for months ahead of the first sort of phase of the election, President at the time, Bolsonaro, and his allies were pushing inflammatory and violent online disinformation on the platforms, including ads, quite similar to what Kristen had mentioned as well, sort of approved and garnering hundreds of thousands of impressions, targeted impressions. And we had summarized about 3 reports following up to what was then the end result, which was a violent coup attempt in January 2023, with live streams of the coup on many of these platforms. And I guess one really problematic part of this is that, as much as we try to engage with the platforms to warn them, to tell them that, what we're seeing is really concerning, what we're seeing looks like a repeat of what we saw on January 6th, what we're seeing looks like a repeat of all of the different scandals and huge pitfalls. Sorry, John, I think your mic is unmuted. Apologies. What we had seen was all of these sort of reoccurrences of problems we had reiterated, and we sort of were met with nothing, right? Like, these platforms sort of gave us the same talking points that I think they share across many of the civil society organizations that do this work. Fast forward a little bit into August of 2023, when the Digital Services Act in the EU was about to kick in. We ran a similar investigation to what Kristen had mentioned in South Africa, where we were trying to sort of stress test whether Meta's online ad library would approve the publication of AI-generated ads, which included calls for a Stop the Steal-like uprising to overturn the results of the Spanish election, incitement of violence against immigrants and the LGBT community, and a series of other explicitly problematic ads. And a majority of these advertisements were approved sort of, instantly. I guess it's important to highlight this because I find one thing I'm seeing is these platforms having faced huge slashes within trust and safety teams are sort of hiding under this cloak of AI innovation by exemplifying or highlighting, the sort of scale and technology of their AI moderation systems. And what is repeatedly being examined as sort of pitfalls is this AI moderation system, which isn't sort of off just in a few instances or fails momentarily. I think what the real issue is that systematically the moderation systems aren't working, and the platforms, as have been mentioned by both the interventions before me, have a huge business model problem where they are incentivized to care mostly just about their bottom line and are disincentivized to care about how and where bad actors are allowed to manipulate that system. So what we see now is a business model that allows a devastation to democratic processes as long as the highest bidder is willing to pay that money. So you have advertisers and bad actors who can go into different platforms and pump hundreds of thousands of dollars moments before key elections to drown or inundate voters with problematic messaging, harmful narratives, disinformation, hate speech, you name it. I think you can find it within the advertisements on many of these platforms. These bad actors sort of have, in a way, it's hard to blame them when they have an entire arsenal of tools to micro-target individuals and voters at their disposal. And platforms sort of remain uncommitted to actually taking the real steps to safeguard their platforms. And I believe that until the stakes are changed, where platforms actually have something that is costly to this devastating spread of disinformation and hate speech, I don't see why or how they would change how they're operating. And I guess that's a little bit of a hard truth, but in line with almost a decade of civil society fighting against these problems, we are seeing some version of hope, right? Like the DSA and the EU sort of provides some light at the end of the tunnel, where there is a sort of iteration of these stakes being changed, where platforms might actually have to think about investing in safeguarding their platforms for regulatory reasons, not just for sort of talking points. And India, as Ritu had mentioned, is quite worrying. I think platforms like YouTube and Meta, there's investigations by Indian fact checkers, as well as other organizations that are showing that these advertisements are also rampant on the same these problematic advertisements are also rampant on YouTube and Meta platforms. And again, they're sort of hiding under this cloak of innovation, providing very detailed sort of India or specific country election plans. But when you dig just even a little bit beyond the surface, I think it's quite easy to see that very little has changed since some of these issues that I've been talking about in Brazil or in 2020 or beforehand. And just again, to reiterate, it's really a privilege to be here with so many people from the Global South. I think that to talk about these platforms as a testing ground in many of our countries, where ironically we are also some of the countries that have the most users and in a way should be the most incentivized by these platforms. It's ironic and sort of harrowing how that very much is not the case, that the Silicon Valley bubble sort of sees the world through the lens of California and the US and the West, and that the problems of the Global South seem to be very distant, even though in many ways they are at the doorstep of the US and the EU with elections nearby as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maen. And now I'm going to open up for questions from the audience. So please raise your hands if you have questions for any of our speakers. And while you're doing that, I might start off with just a question, Kristen, about what you're seeing, you know, in recent times in South Africa of the links between harmful online content and kind of real world harm, the impacts within South Africa of largely, you know, under moderated platforms where harms are proliferating. Kristen.
Sure, thanks, Alex. I think maybe let me refer to the biggest one, and it was the most recent big one, was when former President Jacob Zuma was about to be sentenced or put in jail, and I think this was in July in 2021, and incitement to violence started happening over social media, and that just erupted into riots taking place all over the country, lots of people looting from shops, you know, burning of buildings and of stores, and that primarily took place on social media, and calling for people to react in this way, and then spilled over. A lot of the content that we had taken to use in our adverts has been from political actors themselves, being leveled against journalists or human rights defenders. Very recently, the Helen Suzman Foundation, an NGO acting in the interests of migrants in the country, had to actually close the organization's doors, and all had to work remotely, because both the organization and its executive director at the time were targeted for a positive court case in favor of migrants in the country, and that just led to, you know, attacks by bots on X, people who were targeting the executive director and saying that they know where she lives and where her children's school, making these sort of very violent threats, and nothing was done about it even after it was reported, and so that's the sort of thing that's been happening most recently. Yeah.
Thank you. And please, any questions from the audience? Would be very happy to hear from you all. In the meantime, Maen, maybe could you talk us through some of what you see as being the connections between online content and offline harm in India, what we've seen in recent months and years under the Modi regime?
Yeah, I think a lot of the sort of tactics, I guess, ironically, are kind of the same across many of these countries. I think a lot of bad actors are sort of smart and sharp to know that they can exploit contemporary political issues. For example, in India, specific laws that Modi has maybe passed that human rights organizations have deemed as sort of unjust or discriminatory for a variety of reasons, being pushed on platforms as sort of either to spread disinformation about these specific laws or controversies. We also see targeted attacks against journalists, civil society, those opposed to the BJP, often using smearing campaigns, you know, like trying to individually smear lawmakers or journalists to sort of instigate some sort of violent rhetoric around them. And I guess in India, which I think might be unique from some of these other contexts, is the use of really harmful but really regional or local communal sort of language, right? Like you'll have words or a specific context that I or you might not understand, but within the Indian context has so much weight and meaning. And tying to this point on content moderation, it's not something a machine or an AI moderated content system would be able to pick up. There are things that very much have to be understood within the context of a very dynamic region. And I think ones that, like Ritu was saying, for decades, civil society have been pushing for regulations within the Indian context and within the Indian government. And the platforms sort of parachute in with zero of this context embedded into their systems and leave it super ripe for bad actors to sort of spread and propagate harm.
Thank you. I think we have a question from Mitali Jain. Mitali.
Hi, thanks, Alex. I'm a little late, so apologies if this is repetitive in any way, but thank you to everybody for speaking and for your great research. I had a question specifically at this point for Kristen from LRC. I read about the recent Constitutional Court judgment, which basically allows Jacob Zuma to continue to stand with the MK party in this election. And I'm curious if there's a feeling that that is going to kind of catalyze more online violence ahead of the elections or at some point this year.
Sure, thanks, Mitali. So I think first just to note that, yes, at the beginning, I was talking about political parties and what they've been doing. The MK party is the political party that has already stated that they are planning to dispute the outcome of the elections. And so that was already a concern, I think, before it wasn't a court hearing ruling, it was an electoral court ruling. We haven't yet received the judgment from the electoral court, so we don't know exactly what the court's reasoning is in terms of allowing former President Jacob Zuma to still run as president of that party. But I think there definitely are fears from civil society organizations about what the repercussions of that may be, and particularly because it was the IEC who had first ruled on former President Zuma's lack of, sorry, I'm losing the word, but inability to stand because of his previous incarceration. And so the electoral court ruling, which then now says that he is viable as a candidate, could be used by the former president and by the party to dispute the credibility of the IEC, and obviously that's the body that handles elections and the results of the elections in South Africa. So that's definitely a fear, and I think being felt by CSOs around the country, but not entirely sure still what the basis of that ruling was. And I think once that becomes clearer, it may be a bit easier to dispute any claims to invalidating the credibility of the IEC, but I definitely think that's a tactic that many are writing about that could be used by the party.
So we have a couple of questions in the chat from audience members. The first is, what's the scale of AI use in disinformation in the form of deep fakes and so on? And what are CSOs doing about this? Can I hand over first to Kristen to talk about South Africa, and then perhaps Maen to talk about some of the other countries that ECHO's been working on?
Sure. So I don't know the answer to that question. It's not something that at the Legal Resources Center we've been looking into just yet. But I can maybe speak about what civil society organizations in the country are doing about disinformation in general. There's a CSO called Media Monitoring Africa, and I know that they have entered into some form of agreement with big tech platforms and with the IEC. We aren't entirely sure what that agreement entails and whether there's actual accountability for if the terms of that agreement aren't upheld. Media Monitoring Africa then also is offering an app that people can download, and if they see or spot disinformation, they can then channel it through that platform, and then it either gets dispelled as disinformation or verified as accurate. There's another organization called CODE, C-O-D-E, recently established in South Africa, and they are training people to be online disinformation monitors. And so part of that training includes how to spot and detect misinformation and disinformation online, and then how to report it, and then how to either how to discredit it and get that spread as well. I'm so sorry, Raymond, I really don't have an idea of the scale of AI use in disinformation. I can maybe just say that part of what we had asked for from platforms was specific information around how AI does content moderation on their platforms. That's part of the PIA request I was talking about. We asked for information around that, but like I said, we were rejected, and so we don't have that information yet.
Maen, have you what from your vantage point do you see as being the use of AI in spreading disinformation? Have you been seeing an uptick in that in research that you've been doing?
The only example we have of sort of using AI and showing that it is not that it is sort of capable of being spread in similar ways was the DSA investigation I mentioned in the report, where we sort of generated AI images alongside problematic text, and these were put into Meta's ad library and approved as ads. We never ran the ads, similarly to the other investigation that was mentioned earlier, but showed that the content moderation system was unable to pick up that this was an AI-generated image and had problematic text. I will say this was in August 2023, where AI was maybe just a little bit less sexy. And now I know from sort of reading many of the platform sort of election plans for this year, there's a huge focus on AI, which lends me to believe that they're trying to build up or bolster their systems to at least be able to see and analyze when something is either AI generated or a deep fake. However, I do think one issue that we will see is these systems and these tools to actually understand where and when AI generation is taking place work best in English and work not as well in other languages. So I think it's another example of the global South sort of being this Wild West again, where the sort of nice talking points from big tech platforms might lend to some value in an EU or a US election. However, are probably less relevant when it comes to bad actors in the global South. So I guess this year will be a test, a stress test for how AI deepfakes and AI generated content will be used. I don't think it's a question of if it'll be used. I think it'll be a question of when and how it's going to be used. And I know somebody had mentioned Pakistan. I think it was you, Alex, with examples of deepfakes sort of running. And I guess to iterate, you don't need thousands of these videos to make an impact. I think you just need a few examples of manipulation that can, in theory, garner millions of impressions, whether organically or if there's a bad actor who wants to put some money behind it as paid advertisements. So it's concerning. And I know amongst the Global Coalition and other organizations on this call that there is a lot of concerns and question marks about how AI generation is going to be affecting these elections we're talking about as well as others.
So we have a question around the prospects for electoral management bodies to demand platform accountability. In Africa, we know that electoral management bodies have now adopted guidelines for the use of digital and social media in elections in Africa. In fact, those guidelines did involve some civil society input, including partners within the Global Coalition. So perhaps turning to Kristen, what do you see as the prospects of electoral management bodies demanding and actually obtaining kind of accountability from the platforms?
That's exactly what I was talking about. Sorry, and I don't think I mentioned this, but Media Monitoring Africa is one of the parties to the agreement with big tech platforms. The other one is the Independent Electoral Commission of South Africa. So they are a party to this agreement, and it's not made public, so I can't comment on the components of the agreement. But maybe just to say that whatever those terms are, it isn't a legally binding document. So I think there still will be some sort of gap there if the terms aren't complied with. But I think it is hopeful to know that there is an agreement in place. I did see something yesterday about Meta actually releasing some transparency tools specifically aimed at safeguarding elections in South Africa in collaboration with the IEC. But I think it's yet to be said to what extent those tools and mechanisms will be effective, similar to content moderation mechanisms which exist on the platforms already, but we're seeing aren't actually being implemented. So I think that's yet to be tested, and we'll have to see in the run up to and then post elections as well.
Great. And Maen, do you, from your vantage point, see electoral bodies as being a potential pathway to accountability? I know in Brazil, the Superior Electoral Court played a very important role in the recent elections. Could you speak to that?
Yeah. To be honest, I feel that regulatory bodies, especially when it comes to the elections, actually have, like I was saying, the ability to increase the stakes for platforms in a way that civil society does not, in a way that even media and exposés and investigations do not. Brazil was a great example of this. So even while Bolsonaro, who has very easily fallen into the far right bucket, the Brazilian regulatory body, the Election Commission at that time, and still had a very sort of progressive take on where and how social media platforms must sort of fall into election regulations. And they were very interested not just in the investigations that we would share with them, but also how they could actually sort of utilize the powers that they have to override sort of the harmful disinformation that was spreading. So I believe that Brazil was one example of a country that would actually be able to engage with the platforms to sort of tell them to take down specific content or to initiate specific election-related policies, like the removal of political advertisements ahead of elections, et cetera. And I think there's lots of countries where the regulatory bodies don't want to be sort of working with that sort of progressive outlook on taking on big tech platforms, right? I think India is one example where Facebook India or Meta India actually has sort of a long history of being allegedly sort of tied to the political far right and having sort of political entanglements within the company and the country's politics. And I think that's an example where maybe it's less realistic. And other countries like, in the US, where the sort of lobbies of the big tech companies are very much able to sort of persuade or override progressive regulations that would inevitably be quite important for voters, the general sort of democratic ethos of these countries as well. But progressive sort of regulatory bodies are definitely one of the more important sort of institutions that sort of work hand in hand with civil society and in many cases sort of are excited about looking at the research and work that organizations are doing for the very reason that we share the same sort of end goal of making sure the harmful content stops and that the platforms have some version of accountability.
We have a couple of more questions. The first is whether speakers think that trusted flagging processes like the Real 411 in South Africa is sufficient, or is it just delegating platform duties to civil society? This is very controversial, obviously, but Kristen, do you have views on that?
I'll speak to maybe the first part of the question, which is whether it's sufficient. And I don't think so. Merely just because of the volume of content that's posted on social media every day. I think just on Facebook alone, it's over 4 billion posts that happen per day on the platform. I don't know the exact number in relation to South Africa, but I can't imagine that any external fact checking or flagging app or mechanism would have sufficient capacity to be able to detect and then to decide whether it's accurate or not, and then to put that out in real time before it's already spread. So I don't think it's sufficient, no. The second part of the question, which said, is that merely delegating platform duties to civil society? I would say yes. I don't think that's controversial at all. I think that there should be accountability by big tech platforms for what happens on their platform, and it can't be the job of civil society platforms in a country to take on the role of moderating content and making sure that content on those platforms is accurate and free of hate. So I would definitely think that it is a form of delegating platform duties. But I think it speaks to the larger point that Maen made earlier, just about the platform's business models not supporting them doing this proper and thorough form of content moderation.
Maen, can I ask you the question around the G20 and kind of the idea of having governments agree a common standard for platforms across geographies based on best practices, perhaps like the DSA? What do you think, how do we go about incentivizing governments to take up this matter urgently? And do you think this could bear fruit?
Yeah, I think it's very important, obviously, and relevant, considering the sort of feasibility of misuse by big tech platforms. In that, like I was saying in my intervention, we see sort of similar tactics. We see sort of similar stop the steal movements. We see a sort of commonality across the problems, sort of independent of the region. And if that's the sort of status quo, there needs to be a sort of solution that's sort of independent of the region that really works, right? Like, it isn't to say there just needs to be one solution that is a sort of null or bad solution, but there should be one that is sort of built in or baked in with the principles that civil society, that regulatory bodies, that everyday people are sort of wanting, right? If you look at polls and questions from almost across the world, you see that regular people who use these platforms, the level of concern that they have around them has been growing over the years, in the same way that the level of the harms that have been part of these platforms have been growing. So to have world leaders agree in the same way they've agreed on plastics or carbon emissions or cluster munitions, all of the sort of harmful things that our species have sort of created or manifested, to be able to get in a room and agree upon specific tactics that work to offset those, I think is a very well-intentioned plan. And I also think these big tech companies often hide under this cloak of innovation, but at the end of the day, many of them are multi-billion or trillion-dollar empires. They are more powerful than states. They have funding mechanisms and lobby groups and the ability to sort of override national or even international plans for progressive regulation in a way that even states don't have. And I think that's one thing where people are sort of waking up a little bit to that, like regular people who are sort of outside of this space of ours. But to understand that these platforms, it's no longer, the sort of 2010 years of Facebook just being a cool place where you can connect with people you went to high school with. I think the iterations of harmful content and harmful violence that has spewed from these platforms is sort of very much sort of top of mind for some people, and I think lawmakers ought to take that quite seriously.
Thank you. Now we're coming to time now, so I wanted to thank our speakers today, Kristen, Maen, and Ritu, and all the members of the audience for participating in this event at the end of this first quarter of 2024, and with our call to action for big tech to play its part in protecting people and elections for the rest of this year and in future. That's part P, protection plans that are situation specific, A, accountability for big tech, R, resources. We need more resources to protect these elections, more safeguards and break-glass measures, and T, transparency. Now we're going to we have our open statement with this call to action that is out in the public domain now. We already have 215 organizations and experts from across 55 countries signed on to this call to action. It continues to be open, so we very much welcome for more support and more international solidarity in calling for action to protect the 2024 elections that are happening across the globe now. And we're going to be looking now to the G20 and putting proposals there, as Maen has said, because the regulators that are responsible for this industry's market failures now have to step up as well. So thank you all for joining us today. We very much appreciate your involvement, your solidarity, and the action we're taking together within the Global Coalition for Tech Justice. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.